Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new revenge stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
The first one is titled Bobenlum's Revenge on His Shitty Neighbor. I had a shitty neighbor. His property abutted the rear of mine. He was a bitter old shit who spent his time in his extensive vegetable garden on our property line, an Italian guy, the kind whose homegrown tomatoes probably made his famous red sauce. We were a young family at the time, just the first wave of new people starting to gentrify the working class neighborhood. We had a fixer-upper and a baby. We didn't have much money to work with that first summer, so I spent a lot of time in the yard doing my best to landscape the overgrown jungle left by the previous owners. I basically ripped everything out, until we had a lawn. We had record rainfall that summer, and everyone's property had standing water. That old shit dribbler starts screaming at me one day, while working out back. I can't understand half of it because it's a mix of old man gibberish and Italian. Apparently, he was blaming my removal of massive weeds on my property for flooding his garden. It didn't have anything to do with the regular deluges of rain we were getting, or that our properties were at the bottom of a hill. Once my attempt at reasoning had worn out, I ignored him, turned up my headphones, and went back to work. I was ripping out the last long stretch of weeds and laying grass seed along the rear property line. The next day, we get a knock on our door. It's a city inspector, asking us to show them the drainage we installed without a permit. I had no idea what they were talking about, so I asked how they knew about it. They claimed they couldn't say, but they wanted to see the rear property line I had worked on yesterday. I simply told them that I had not installed drainage, I had removed weeds and seeded. Pointing out the supposed drainage location, I indicated that no one in their right mind would install drainage there. They agreed and left. The plot curdled slightly. I should mention that this wasn't just me. That old shit swallower had a similar demeanor with his other abutting neighbors. One of them was a hard-drinking carpenter who lived next to me, and he recommended that I just offer to beat the duck out of that old shitbagger like he did the last time that old shitsharter complained to him. Apparently, that was the reliable standard in the neighborhood. I, however, was not interested in beating up an old shitschrifter who was clearly all too happy to run to the city with lies. I went about my business, until that old shitstrainer yelled at my wife and baby while they were alone in the yard one day. My mother was helping at the house, and went outside to see what was happening. That old shitsharpie screamed at my mother, too, old man spittle, incomprehensible words, surprising volume, shaking jowls, etc. Well, duck him. The old neighborhood may have opted to beat the crap out of that old shit Sunday, but he was quite clearly too full of crap for anyone to ever completely beat the crap out of him. I pulled some money from other house projects and I built a fence. It was a gorgeous suburbanite fence. It was made out of resin, a brilliant white, and installed professionally by fencers. It was a perfect white picket fence, the American dream of fencing, a beacon of gentrification hope in the middle of a working-class neighborhood of overgrown yards and cars on blocks. I have a Murek Abona just thinking about it. Except for that old shit sergeant, our shared property line did not get a white picket fence. Our shared property line got an 8-foot-tall solid security fence. I watched him that day, from my window, as that old shitmilker stood in his garden and glared at the workers installing the resin equivalent of the Berlin Wall along our property line and his beloved garden. That old shitslapper may have noticed the temperature dropping, because his entire garden was now cast in shadow. I waited at the window most of that day. I watched his garden. I watched him in his garden. I watched him wait for the sun to come back. The sun did not return to his tomatoes. With his gaudy landscaping of cheap waterfalls, ornamental trees, and various other tasteless crap, and my new fence, his garden no longer had much sun exposure. The weather got colder, the fall and winter passed, and I saw less and less of that old shitminion. I saw him replant the next season, but I rarely saw him outdoors after that year. His garden was meager, according to my view from our second floor. When I started this post, I told you that I had a shitty neighbor. The following winter, I saw someone new in that old shitnibbler's yard. I never saw that old shitsmoker's family, presumably because his attitude towards his neighbors carried over to his family. I greeted the newcomer, thinking he had just moved in. It turned out that he was that old shit hustler's son, and that old shit jockey had deteriorated over the year and had to be moved to a care facility. I'm assuming he died that year, because a new family moved in during the summer. I removed the security fencing and replaced it with picket to match the rest of the property. Good fences make good neighbors. The next one is titled, My Grandpa Destroys a Wall and Crazy Neighbor Pays for It. Okay, so not my revenge, so I don't know if I am allowed to post, but this is really funny story constantly being retold to family members. Before I was born, my grandpa had just retired and decided, duck it, I am going to live in the middle of a mountain that is in the middle of nowhere. He bought a piece of land far away from any city or village and started building a house. His only neighbors were an old lady and a crazy idiot. After half a year, he decided to permanently move in there and started building more and more things to accommodate himself. One of the things he built were a wall around his property and an outdoor toilet. This will be important later on. During this time, his crazy neighbor was trying to sell property. My grandpa offered to buy it from him, but the guy declined, asking for 10 times more than my grandfather offered. They got into a sort of an argument and ended all communication. Now the crazy bastard was out to get my grandpa. He would call communal services and make police officers and inspectors come on a 2-hour ride for every possible thing he could. We are talking about stuff like leaving a dog without the leash in a walled-off backyard, or having leftover building materials on road, which my grandpa also built. Before that they had freaking dirt road. Now my grandpa did not mind. But every time police was involved, they had to go over the backyard belonging to the old lady, since works were going on, and crazy neighbor sealed off a gate connecting his and my grandpa's property with garbage. It did not look nice, or smell nice, but my grandpa was busy with other stuff to keep removing it every night, only for the bastard to rebuild it next morning. Even though my grandpa did not give a crap, the lady did, and she was on my grandpa's side. So one day when the officers came, she asked a couple of questions to these lovely people. She then contacts my grandpa. She learned 2 things. First of all, since the wall was built on my grandfather's land, he had all the rights to it. He could destroy it completely if he wanted. Second, filling a gate in the wall with crap was illegal. But my grandfather did not have right to build a gate into someone else's yard without explicit permission either, and pursuing it in court would only end up with having to seal it off. She informs my grandpa about all of this, and soon they hatch a plan. They wait for 3 months for heavy autumn rains to start drowning the land, then old lady files a formal complaint about the smell of the garbage. My grandpa pleads guilty and signs off a document that legally forces him to destroy the gate and remove the garbage from it. Now the very same day my grandpa signs off on the documents, the biggest storms of year starts. It rained for 7 days before inspectors could come to remove the garbage and the gate. Now my grandfather had previously cemented 3 of the 4 drains that were built in the wall. This plus the mountain being steep resulted in wall acting like a dam for all the water that was coming in. Almost entire yard was filled with water, eventually even lifting everything up from the outdoor toilet my grandfather built. His neighbor tried everything he could to stop the inspectors from destroying that garbage-filled gate. He pleaded and pleaded, but he could do nothing. He did not own the wall, and he was the one making all the communal calls, and the inspectors grew to hate him. Furthermore, my grandfather had pleaded guilty, meaning that any form of complaint on the decision of the court from a third party was impossible and deemed invalid at this point. After the inspectors removed the gate, a small sea of crap, construction materials and water poured into the yard of the a-hole and ended up watching the water destroy his entire yard, all while my grandpa and nice old lady were drinking tea from her balcony. Today, while telling me the story, he told me, I felt like God unleashing the flood upon the sinful world back then. Which made me chuckle because I know he is an atheist like me. Aftermath was even better. Needless to say, the guy needed to pay thousands to repair all the water damage and cleaning he had to do, all the while my grandfather's and old lady's house were completely untouched by any of it, since they were on a lot higher ground. The best part is that since he admitted he was the one filling the gate with garbage to the inspectors, they made a note of that, and sometime later he received a written order from the court that he had to repay my grandpa for any property damage because of that. He ended up going to court, losing, after the old lady testified in my grandfather's favor, and having to rebuild the gate that was destroyed along with all the court fees. The guy moved out as soon as he could, and from what the new owner said, he sold it for less than half of what my grandfather offered him. Dishonest neighbor finds himself unable to sell his house. This isn't my pro-revenge but my father's, who escalated his petty revenge to all-out professional. Years ago my neighbor was trying to sell his house during the fall and he was selling it for incredibly more than it was worth, almost 6 figures higher. To make the property seem worth that figure, he would wake up early in the morning and take a leaf blower and blow the leaves past his front lawn into our backyard, and then some, making it seem like his front yard went all the way to our driveway, and also included our beautiful tree older than all the homes in the area combined. We never had a backyard fence because his kids were my age and we'd all play on the swing attached to that tree together. We were all cool. My dad wasn't too keen on this because he didn't want to get in a property dispute with the new owner, so he found the official property lines, and guess what? His front lawn ended about 3 feet from his house. So my dad bought some little stakes with orange ribbon and hammered them into the ground to show where the actual property line was. Next day they were gone, thrown into the woods that surround us. My dad fetched them, nailed them back in and knocked on the door asking him to cut the crap. Next day gone once again with a passive-aggressive note on our door. My dad is a rather intimidating guy when frustrated, and he was apparently too scared to be confrontational, saying we need to just be cool with it and let him do his scam so he can sell the house. My dad then decided to up the ante and went to a hardware store and bought 4 12-feet iron rods, took out his ladder, and used the backside of an axe to nail it about 8 to 9 feet into the ground. And then watered the grass or did something so it couldn't just be yanked right out. So now there were just 4 ugly rods poking out of the lawn with bright orange ribbon tied to the top. My family goes away for a weekend, came back Monday, and all 4 are gone, tossed into the woods, and our backyard in those 4 spots are trashed with little holes, from when he spent hopefully a long time digging those bad boys up. Obviously my dad was furious and he just silently stood there for about 20 minutes with a burning rage deep inside, and our entire family could hear him scheming. He turned around, hopped back in the car and disappeared for hours, only to return with a tow truck coming behind him. He popped over to a junkyard, found essentially a frame of a car and bought it for its worth in metal, and then had it shipped to his backyard, which he plopped just before the property line. My dad walked into our house like a great conqueror saying, "Let's see him throw that into the woods." The neighbor showed up later that afternoon, followed by prospective buyers who just stood in his driveway gawking at the junker 4 feet from the house. He tried to brush it off, and as soon as they left he came over just yelling about how he was going to call the cops on us and home association for depreciating the value of his property, to which my dad said, "Sure, go ahead and I'll let them know about what you've been pulling for the past few weeks." Eventually they came to the agreement that the junker would leave the yard if he paid to have it removed and shipped away, and ever since then he stopped messing with the yard and stopped messing with the leaves. The next one is titled, "Neighbor Tells Gramps He Should Mind His Own Damn Business." That advice costs neighbor most of his yard and a car. Gramps had just moved into a retirement park with a lot that backed up to county land that was a nature preserve. His backyard was basically non-existent, but he didn't mind as he got to look out over the preserve. However, he did marvel at how his next-door neighbor's backyard extended a good 8 feet past his, giving neighbor a nice space back there. Gramps tried to be friendly with all his new neighbors, exchanging phone numbers and the like, and one day he noticed the next-door neighbor was putting down expensive pavers that extended from his back door all the way to the old fence posts that designated the preserve boundary. Gramps watched the neighbor yank the 3 rickety fence posts out of the ground and move them back an extra 2 feet into the preserve before pounding them back in, then started to clear the land, intending to gain himself more area for his pavers. Gramps used to work for the National Park Services as a young lad, so he thought he had better warn his neighbor of the consequences of his actions, so he heads out back for a little chat. Neighbor is immediately defensive, and before Gramps says much, neighbor tells him, "You're new here, I've been here 10 years, and to mind your own damn business." Gramps decides not to press the issue. Nothing happens that year, but the following year, when most of the park emptied out to head north for the summer, the county comes by to check on the preserve. Gramps notices them going back and forth behind his neighbor's house. The workers are pulling out maps and taking photos and making phone calls, and soon more guys show up. Turns out neighbor has moved the posts several times over the years, and in reality his backyard is supposed to be even smaller than Gramps' backyard. To make it worse, neighbor put pavers in the back specifically to park both his golf cart and a cherry red sports car back there for the summer, so the county will have to move them before they can do anything else. They tape a notice to the front door and leave. Gramps goes over to read it, and it states that neighbor was in violation of encroaching onto protected lands. He has 30 days to move his car, tear up the pavers and pay a fine of $11,000 because of damage to endangered species who inhabit the protected lands, as well as trespassing fees. Failure to do so within 30 days will result in golf cart and car being towed and impounded. Pavers will be dug up and carted off at neighbor's expense, and the fine will increase for every additional day past the deadline. 30 days comes and goes, so a week after that Gramps has quite the show as first the car and cart were towed, pavers were dug up and hauled off, and the old fence posts and ropes were replaced with metal posts embedded into buried cement bases, connected by steel cables. Whole process took several weeks to finish, but the preserve looked a lot more legit when they were done. A few solar cameras were installed so the county could monitor the wildlife and encroachers remotely. Meanwhile, more notices were taped to the front door of neighbor's house. By November, the snowbirds were flooding back into the park, including neighbor. That was Gramps' second show of the summer as neighbor reads all the notices, digging down until he reads the first one, then runs out back and starts screaming and cussing up a storm, before running back to his car to dig out his cell phone so he can call the county to find out where his car and golf cart were. Gramps stays indoors to avoid the guy as he is frantically trying to unload his car, turn on his water and electricity, get the AC and the toilets going, and all the while trying to get someone at county to pick up the phone and give him some answers. He finally gets a live person and proceeds to scream at them while on speakerphone about his car and cart, so the call keeps getting kicked to other people because who wants to help a screamer? Basically, neighbor is told to come to the county office to get this straightened out. 3 days later, neighbor catches Gramps outside and asks if he was here when the county stole his car and destroyed his backyard. Gramps said he was, and neighbor says, "Well, why didn't you call me when you saw them putting notices on my door? You had my number up north." Gramps said he had thought about doing that but figured neighbor would prefer him to mind his own damn business, so he decided against it. The last one is titled Bad Neighbors. This happened several years ago. I was working full-time at a mediocre paying job while putting myself through college at night, paying for it out of pocket. This left me stretched on finances, so I ended up in a less than ideal apartment complex, and by less than ideal, I mean that the cops maintained a presence there most of the time. Most folks kept to themselves, but occasionally you'd get someone that was just obnoxious living near you. It was inevitable. I knew it was my turn with an obnoxious neighbor when I first met him. He was talking loudly in the breezeway of my building. Why he wasn't on the balcony of his apartment, I don't know. Not wanting to be petty, I just turned the TV up and ignored him. It wasn't long before the talking got louder and my door started moving like someone was trying to open it. I jerked it open and the guy about fell in. It turns out he was leaning on it while having his conversation. After politely letting him know that it was very annoying, I give him an "it's all good" and close my door. Immediately he refers to me using a racial slur in Spanish to the person on the other end of the phone. I may not be fluent in Spanish, but I know some important slang. He'd have parties all night, sometimes with a dozen people in the breezeway getting drunk and rowdy. There was always trash on the stairs, e.g., half-eaten cheeseburgers, old milkshakes, etc., and cigarette butts everywhere. His large pit bull would bark all day just about non-stop. I could bitch about it and be the whiny neighbor, or just bide my time until I graduate and then move. Graduation was only a semester away, so I decided to bide my time. Coming home from school one night, I'm walking through the parking lot reading my phone when I see a dog running at me growling. It's dude's pit bull rearing to attack me. Dude's girlfriend yells at him and he calls his dog off and breaks out laughing. Enough's enough, someone's going to get hurt, so I complain to the apartment manager, but am told without proof their hands were tied. Great. I live the next few months at the complex relatively incident-free, just the above annoyances, until I'm woken up one weeknight at 2 a.m. There's screaming and crying in the breezeway, lots of loud talking, and the sounds of incoming sirens. Looking out my window into the parking lot and I see dude run by with his dog. Looking through the peephole I see a girl in the hallway bleeding profusely. Turns out his girlfriend and her friend were drunk and raised their voices at one another. The dog then attacked the friend, mauling her pretty badly. Police didn't know where either dude or the dog was, and the friend didn't want to pursue charges, so they left. Shortly after they left, dude comes back with the dog. I did call the police and let them know that he and the dog were back, but they never returned, thanks police. On my way to work the next morning I stopped by the apartment manager and let her know about the incident. Again she says she can't do anything without proof. I implore her to call the police and confirm, but she refuses, saying they get updates from the sheriff every month. Ultimately her problem was that due to legal reasons she can't seek to evict someone herself, otherwise it might look like she's targeting a given race or something. Fuming about the situation while at work I managed to find the police incident report for the mauling online. I printed it out and delivered it to her on my way home. She had an appreciative look on her face and told me the eviction process would start before I could leave the building. True to her word, the bad neighbor was out at the end of the month. According to the apartment manager, they were upset and cussing as they drove away. Turns out he had numerous warrants, so had his girlfriend rent the apartment. Neither of them had family in the area. The girlfriend's family lived in another country, so they had no one to turn to for a place to stay. The icing on the cake was when the apartment manager let slip that when the next apartment called her for a reference, she'd kindly inform them of all incidents that occurred. I don't know what happened to them, but I do know they had a hard time finding a place to live. Thanks for listening.